Good morning, friends, and thanks for joining me again. It's Bob bringing you another reflection on becoming like Jesus, becoming Jesus' disciple, and what does it mean to actually enter into that process of discipleship. That's what we call it, but Jesus is his call, our core business, everything is about that. It is about building a community of people who are increasingly becoming like Jesus. That's being a disciple. So how I want to just further the discussion, because yesterday I talked about basically how we have come onto the playing field of seeing that house church is indispensable in terms of us growing people into Christ likeness, us growing disciples, well, and us being disciples. But I want to just spark your imagination for a little bit. I want to ask you to think about this and meditate on this for a while. Think about what it was like to be one of the 12. Jesus picked this 12 out of this group of people that were traveling with him, that were following him already. So it's accurate to say that a disciple is a Christ follower, that we are actually following this teacher. We're completely immersing ourselves into him, his way of life, into his world, into who he is. So with that in mind, what did they experience? And how would that actually be replicated in the now? Well, think about that. There were 12 of them. There weren't 150 of them. There weren't 2,000 of them. Yes, he fed 3,000 and 5,000 in different points in time. So he was speaking to larger crowds, but that's not who he was discipling. He was teaching, he was making the kingdom of God known, he was declaring the kingdom, but he was investing in this small community of disciples. And so in Acts chapter 6, that's what they call the early church, is called a community of disciples. A community of disciples. I just think that's so beautiful because it's what we are. It's what God has called us to be. He's not called us to be a large gathering. He's called us to be a community of disciples. So with that in mind, then if you get under the hood, if you start looking at what did Jesus do with these guys? And it wasn't just guys. Mary Magdalene was part of this group. Probably Jesus' mom was part of this group at different points in time. There were women that were a part of the group. And there were in the apostolic troops and everything that were going on as well. So it's men and women, and they're traveling with Jesus. And he is spending time with them around meals, like lots of meals. Meals are a really big deal to Luke. I love that. Meals are a big deal to Christians. I have been for a long time, but in Luke's gospel, practically everything happens over a meal. Everything eternally consequential happens over a meal. And so they eat together and they eat together and they eat together and they eat together. So they eat together a lot. And there's something that happens over the food. There's conversations that happen over the food. There's questions. Jesus asks questions. The apostles ask questions. They're processing, they're owning, and around the fire at these small meals is a learning environment where a larger crowd feeding the 5,000, he's declaring things. He's giving the Sermon on the Mount. He's talking to large crowds of people and teaching them. And so that's a monologue kind of a situation, but around the fire, around the dinner table, there's learning that's going on. That's a learning environment. And you know as well as I do that learning and teaching and learning are two very different things. That we can teach people how to be taught, or we can teach people how to be learners. And the learners are the ones that are going to continue to be transformed by what they're learning, because they are asking questions, they're entering in, they're discovering, they're diving in, they're questioning, because it's like, I don't get it. This doesn't make sense. And the disciples, there's so many times where they're like, I don't get it. Just think about the parables. Like, Jesus, why are you saying these things in such a cryptic sort of way? And they're dialoguing with him about that, asking and trying to dive underneath. Jesus gives these word pictures in these parables, and they are diving in and wrestling with this and trying to figure out, what is he saying? Because I can tell, it's like when I was reading Dallas Willard stuff, really early on, I'm like, gosh, this stuff is so meaty and so deep, but I have to read a paragraph 3 times to be able to get what he's saying. Why? Because he's not netting it out in a bullet point, because he knows that if we have to pursue it a bit, that will actually cause us to become learners, and becoming learners makes us change. So first thing that we see about this small troop of disciples, which become house churches later on in the New Testament era, and for us, same, is that they eat, that they process together, and they grow in relationship with each other, but they become learners. They're learners. They're learners. That is the big net of one of the big nets of house church, is that it is a learning environment. It's an environment where you are learning and you're able to pull things apart and say, I don't get it. Would you help me understand that? If I say something on Sunday morning and nobody gets it, they're not going to raise their hand and say, excuse me, Bob, could you, give another shot at that? Because I'm really not getting it. That's not what happens. We're it's just not the right environment for that. But around a fire, around a meal, oh yeah, baby. And that's where the change happens. That's where we start owning the truth, and the truth makes us free because we own it. It's not because you just heard it, it's because you own it. Thanks so much for joining me today. We'll pick this up again with the next post, just in terms of learning what house church is and why it's so important. Love you. Thanks for joining me. God bless you.